Delighted to be here, and I really genuinely appreciate you coming out tonight and giving me your attention in the midst of the busyness of your lives, and I will try to make it worth your while as we talk about what seems to be a preposterous question. I mean, of course we want a world without evil. So that's my answer. The end. Time for questions. But given that there is so much evil in the world, do we want to conclude that it's actually unnecessary? I mean, it's bad enough that there is suffering and that the world contains wickedness and disaster and plague and scarcity of all sorts, but what if it all is actually pointless, or even some of it? I mean, do we really want to think there's such a thing as unnecessary evil, what philosophers call gratuitous evil? Well, let's back up. Why is there any evil at all? And I'm representing the Christian point of view, or at least a sort of mainstream Christian point of view. And in the Bible, as traditionally interpreted at least, God is busy with a plan. God is actually intentionally guiding human affairs towards some kind of end. So what is that end? What's it all about? And there's a lovely Hebrew word that we translate peace, which is a little bit weak in English. But this word shalom means flourishing. It means that God not only wants there to be an absence of strife, an absence of violence, an absence of evil, but that God aims for everything that He has created to become fully itself, to become the best that it can be. Each individual realizing his or her or its potential. And God wants each of the relationships among individuals to thrive, where people treat each other with respect and even affection and goodwill. And people want, God wants groups of people, organizations, to actually function the way they're supposed to. Imagine a university that functioned the way it was supposed to. Glory to God. Imagine a civil service that functioned the way it was supposed to. Imagine a tax regime that functioned the way it's supposed to, if there is such a thing in the world to come. Imagine these groups working with each other and seamlessly and cooperatively and frictionlessly working together the way they're supposed to. Imagine what we could get done if we just got out of each other's way. And imagine us as human beings cooperating properly with the rest of our fellow creatures on earth, so that everything we do is in a kind of proper symbiotic relationship with this world on which we depend and which depends on us. And all of this in concert with a God who loves us and encourages us to greater and greater creativity. It's this global view that is meant by the Hebrew idea of shalom. It's this global view of flourishing that God has in mind for the creation He started way back when. Part of shalom, clearly then, part of what is crucial to this flourishing world is love. Not just sentimentality and warm feelings, but genuine regard for the other, affection for the other, care for the other. God loves love, and He loves to be loving those who can love back and love each other. And so in this circle of love, for there to be love in the world, there has to be freedom. Now, it's important that freedom is understood as a kind of instrumental good. It's not an ultimate good. It's not that freedom in itself is good, because freedom actually can be used to all sorts of nefarious ends. But freedom has to be operative if there's going to be love in the cosmos. And God creates creatures who are capable of freedom, and therefore capable of choosing to love or not to love. We might wonder why God doesn't create us automatically loving. I have a small computer up here, and if I had the necessary technical expertise, I could program this computer every time it boots up to say back to me, "I love you, John," which would be sad, right? If I were to do that, that would just be sad for a grown man to do that with his iPad. I gave a lecture like this at the University of Ottawa, and about 2 weeks later, I got a string of code sent to me, and I put it into my computer from a friend, and it boots up and says, "I love you, John." And I thought that was kind of funny, and I cleared it, and I went to work. 2 minutes later, I said, I love you. You're ignoring me, John. Of course, I'll turn this off. Right? So automatic love really isn't worth very much. I know there are days in which it might look pretty good, but it's not the real thing, right? Love requires us to be free to love or not love, to give it or to withhold it. So this is why God creates agents in the universe, at least ourselves, angels, perhaps others as well, that are capable of saying yes or no to love. It's not automatic. This helps us understand an answer to a question that many people ask, which is, why did God create evil? And the answer is, God didn't, because there's no such thing as evil. Now, what I mean by that, in case you suspect me of philosophical legerdemain, is that there's no such thing as evil in terms of, like, there's no molecules of evil, right? There's not some black jello coursing through the universe, this evil blob that infects things as it touches them. God doesn't sit around in heaven in time past immemorial and look at the angels and say, it's kind of boring around here. Everything works, everything goes the way it's supposed to, everything's on time. Let's shake it up a little bit. Let's add a little pepper to the stew. Let's create some evil and see what happens. Like, that's not what happened. God doesn't create evil. God creates creatures capable of love. And to do that, he has to create them capable of not love, capable of mischief. And so God felt it was worth it to have more love in the universe, and creates creatures capable of that. And of course, we are capable of that, and we're capable of not love, and we're capable of what Christian theology and other theologies as well call sin. This misuse of freedom to love the wrong things or to love the right things in the wrong way. And we've become pretty good at that. We've had a lot of practice. And we've now had generation after generation and culture upon culture and century upon century, layer upon layer of sin. Lots of good things too, lots of wonderful things in the history of humankind, but lots and lots of mischief and murder and mayhem. And God is trying to rescue us from that. And the Christian view of things is that if God is going to run a world, and God is going to run the world such that it's going to be good for us, that it's going to do for us what we need doing, it's going to have to provide at least three things that we badly need. First, if the world is going to do for us what we need done, it's going to have to show us our situation. It's going to have to give us the information we need. It's going to have to give us a reality check. My late father was a cancer surgeon, and every morning he would spend his time in the operating room working on cancer, and people would be anesthetized, and he would just go to work as a surgeon, and they'd wheel the patient out, and he'd go clean up, and they'd wheel another patient in, and he'd go to work. But in the afternoon, he dealt with people who weren't anesthetized. He'd deal with conscious patients, and at least once or twice a day, for about 30 years, he would sit across from somebody in his office and break the bad news that he or she had cancer, and not only had some cancer, but so much cancer that he would have to operate. Once or twice a day, he would have to say to somebody who felt perfectly fine that they were not perfectly fine. In fact, they were mortally ill. Once or twice a day, he was going to have to say to people, I know you feel fine, but you're really not. And in fact, if we don't operate soon, if you don't undergo the tremendously difficult and painful regimen of cancer surgery, you are going to die. Now, you can imagine that they didn't believe him right off the bat. Who would want to? And he'd say, I understand you want a second opinion. Here's a list of the other specialists in the area, but you might want to make an appointment with me on your way out, because I'm not wrong. This really is the situation you're in. One of the reasons it seems to me, and it seems to others as well, that God allows there to be evil in the world, and so much evil in the world, allows us to do what we do to each other, is so that the world holds up a mirror to us and says, take a look. That's what you're really like. See, a lot of us find it easier to say, well, you know what? There's three kinds of people in the world. There's really, really evil people. Take your pick of your favorite villains. And then there's really super good people. You know, Mother Teresa and, well, Mother Teresa. And other people as well. And then there's the rest of us in the sort of the vast middle. And we're not, nobody's perfect, but, we're not terrible. We haven't killed our mom or half the town or whatever. We're kind of in the middle here, struggling along, not too bad. And that's not the way the Bible says we are. The Bible says that we are all riddled with moral cancer. That however much health we present with, inside we're in big trouble, and we're all capable of evil. And one of the things that the news will keep telling us, and history will keep telling us if we will only listen, is that we're all capable. We're all capable of murder, we're all capable of adultery, we're all capable of treason, we're all capable of at least something that is mortally wrong. And so are our societies, because there isn't any culture in the world, not Roman, not Greek, not Persian, not Chinese, not Indian, not European, not Australian, not Canadian, that doesn't have blood on our hands, and quite a bit of it. Right? None of us can say, other people, yeah, maybe other people could do that, maybe another culture could do that, maybe another nation could do it, but not us. I mean, nobody's in that situation if we'll pay attention to that. And if God were instead were to swoop in and sort of pick up after us really quickly and keep these horrible ideas from occurring to us, we wouldn't know. But we're not in kindergarten, right? This is grown-up world. And we have to see that actions have consequences. We have to see that what we do really matters. And so God allows us the opportunity to confront our moral state. Well, that's just enough to depress everybody. So God's got to do more than that. God's got to give us a chance to recognize the problem, but then leave it behind. God's got to give us an opportunity to cut the chains that connect us with all the mischief that we've done in the past. We need not only recognition of what's wrong with us, but we need forgiveness. And how are we going to get that? How are we going to get that from relatives that we've hurt who've since died? We can't ask them for forgiveness anymore. How are we going to ask forgiveness for being involved corporately in sins against other peoples? What does it even make sense to do to ask forgiveness about things that happened 100 years ago or 500 years ago? I mean, what does that even mean? How can we be free of Jacob Marley's chains that we have forged link by link that we drag around with us? How can God help us with that? By doing what religions all around the world say needs to be done. And when you pile up bad karma, when you sin and therefore damage the universe, you suffer for that. And the Christian understanding, which is why we have crosses in the places of honor in our holy places, the Christian understanding is that God was willing to suffer in our stead. But somebody has to. And that's a kind of moral instinct we all feel. If you damage the universe, you damage somebody else, you should suffer for that. And the Christian logic is the same. Yes, somebody's going to suffer. But the great good news is that God's willing to suffer for us and give us that fresh start. But even that's not enough. And it's actually a poor church that preaches forgiveness and leaves it at that, as if once you're in, you're fine. No, once you're in, you're about as fine as a newborn baby in an emergency room. That's not enough. You've got to grow up. And we've got to learn to grow up to become morally mature beings. It's not enough to be born again. It's not enough to get a fresh start. One has to actually have the kind of experience of rehabilitation to unlearn all these bad habits that we've learned from our parents and our ancestors and our cultures. We have to find ways of unlearning our own bad habits to be straightened out and to become true and good, the kinds of people that in our best moments we long to be. Now, I don't know about you, but I find that if I have bad habits, I have them because I like them. They do something for me. And I only quit them if I have an awfully good reason. And I've often said to my wife, who looks at me askance and notices that I'm bigger than I was when we got married, I said, well, yeah, I know, I should eat less. I mean, I really like to eat. And coming to Adelaide and being in all this wine country, it's not been good for me at all. And I want to thank you very much for that. And I'm thinking that all I need is a little tiny heart attack, just a little stroke, just enough to scare the crap out of me so that I finally lose the 30 pounds that are sending me to an early grave. Because I know without that, I'm going to keep on going, right? I know better. My dad was a physician. My wife's a physiotherapist. I know better. But bring out that pork belly. I didn't mean mine. I meant the dish, actually. And I'm there. So what God does is lovingly provide for me and quite seriously for the world the difficulties that some of us need to change our ways. Because frankly, I don't change my mind about things that matter unless I have to. And you're pretty much the same, right? We don't change our ways unless we have to. And God prevents us from just blithely going to our graves without at least giving us a chance to turn, and a pretty good chance to turn. And that's what, in many of our lives, it means for us to encounter genuine suffering, even horrible suffering. So that's the world we live in, it seems to me. It's an opportunity for us to confront who we really are as a race and as individuals. God gives us the opportunity for a fresh start, and God gives us the opportunity to grow up, to be rehabilitated and sorted out. And that's the world we live in. It's a world that's actually matched to our real needs rather than to, frankly, our preferences. Because if we think that God is supposed to run a world in which we're happy all the time, and we clearly aren't, then obviously God is doing a terrible job of running the world. But actually making us happy all the time would be relatively easy for God. All he would have to do is miraculously just keep injecting us with the right opioids. All we need to do, as Aldous Huxley says in Brave New World, is just be on soma all the time. I drive home from the University of British Columbia and the west side of Vancouver to my home in North Vancouver by way of Canada's poorest postal code, the downtown east side. And every day I drive home, and I pray for some of the people I see because I see that they look really happy because they've got a fix. But I don't think that's the way we want to live. Happiness can sometimes be subhuman. So for God to merely tranquilize us or to merely elevate our mood when he needs to actually cure our sickness would be irresponsible of God. What God should be doing is not just treating our symptoms, but treating, in fact, our disease. What we need from God, like we would need from any good parent or friend or coach, is tough love. That's no tougher than it has to be, but is no less than it must be to get done what needs doing. Yeah, but this is God, right? This isn't some human coach. This isn't some human parent with limited abilities and limited resources and so on. This is God. So why doesn't God just... Well, before we finish that sentence, and we'll come back and finish it in a couple of ways, let me suggest as a theologian that it's important to realize that God, despite what you may have heard if you've had some contact with the Christian church, God can't do just anything. And Christians sometimes blithely say, well, God's omnipotent, God's almighty, which means that God can do anything. But that's not true. And as a theologian, I want to set you straight about that, and aren't you glad you came to a lecture tonight to hear about that? God can't do just anything. What do you mean? Well, for instance, God can't do things that don't exist and that can't possibly exist. God, so far as we can imagine, can't create a married bachelor. In the nature of the case, there's no such thing. It's a contradiction in terms. God can't create a square circle. As far as we know, there's literally no such thing by definition. It's not as if there's something there for God to make that God can't make. There's nothing there for God to make. Now you say, okay, that seemed like a laborious way of stating the obvious, but God's not simply not creating silly things like square circles. It's that things that can't happen, in the nature of the case, even God can't do, because there's nothing really for God to do there. Nor can, in fact, God do evil, which means, by entailment, that there are quite a number of things that I can do that God can't. Like sin. Like I'm actually quite good at that. Years of practice. So there's all kinds of evil things that I can do that God can't do. Why? Because God's nature is holy and good, and you can't do things against your nature. And that's true for us human beings as well. There's no way that a genuinely loving mother can enjoy torturing her children. She might have a gun to her head. She might be in the worst sort of Sophie's Choice situation. She still can't enjoy torturing her children. It's not in her to do that. There's no way that a loyal patriot can cheerfully sell out his country. It's not in him to do that. Other people can do it. But we wouldn't say that that's some kind of tragic lack of ability in the mother or the patriot. We'd say that's good that they can't do that. And God's good that way. There are things that God can't do in the nature of the case. There are things that God can't do because of the nature of God. And there are things that God can't do because God has set up certain kinds of systems or complexes or plans or narratives. And he has to let them run, or he has to fold them up. But God, even God, can't eat his cake and have it too. If he wants us to be free, he's got to let us be free. If he wants us to choose between love and not love, he's got to let us choose between love and not love. And there's only so much jumping in that God can do to intervene before the system simply falls apart. It simply lacks integrity. God's got to be consistent with what God has intended to do, or it simply fails. So we might say, well, okay, we acknowledge that we're sinful, but why doesn't God simply make us instantly holy? Why doesn't God just make us stop hurting each other? Why does God not make us lose instantly the desire even to do ourselves harm? Well, apparently God can't. Because of course he would if he could. Why wouldn't he? I mean, God's at least as logical as you are. He's at least as logical as I am. So if he could make us all holy, happy, and healthy in an instant, presumably God would. But the fact that God doesn't do that doesn't mean that there's no God, necessarily. Might mean that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. Nor does it mean that God doesn't want to do that, but that in the nature of the case, there's something about us that apparently cannot be made mature by some kind of order of God. If God can't apparently just download holiness into us, or we would be different than we are. Why can't God similarly make us holy without suffering? Because apparently he can't. I mean, I have to say that most of the moral growth that I've experienced in my life has come under duress. How about you? Most of the ways I've become a better man have come because I've been compelled to consider whether I wanted to become a better man, and I made certain choices. But they weren't easy choices, and I didn't welcome them. So why doesn't God make us holy without suffering? Well, apparently God can't, because otherwise, of course, he would. Or why doesn't God just leave us alone? Why doesn't he just leave us alone? Why doesn't he just let us be and not put us through this difficult regimen? Well, apparently God can't do that either, because he loves us. Because he's not going to let us die in our own derangement, our own dereliction, and our own fatal illness. But surely, even if Stackhouse, even if I grant, which I'm not sure I want to, but even if I grant that yes, in some cases we're better off for the world being the way it is, there seems to be so much evil. There seems to be a superfluity of evil. There seems to be gratuitous evil. I mean, look around you. Wake up, buddy. I mean, look at all the evil there is in the world. There just seems to be an overwhelmingly useless amount of evil. And it does feel that way sometimes. It feels that way to me too. It does. Maybe it doesn't look like it tonight. I've got my jacket and tie on. I look, reasonably clean and healthy, and it looks like I've had a pretty easy life. But, lots of us have suffering that other people don't see, and we get to see other people's suffering that marks us. I knew my paternal grandmother for the last 30 years of her life when she struggled with multiple sclerosis, and she was one of the sweetest people I've ever met. And I struggle with the reasons why God would have allowed my beautiful grandmother to die that slow death of MS. And then when my mom got cancer in her 50s, I did not understand why she suffered as much as she did, only to hang on in a kind of ghost of herself until she was in her late 70s, hardly recovering from the therapy she had to undergo. And right now, back in Vancouver, I don't understand why my vigorous physiotherapist wife, who just 2 months ago could climb one of Vancouver's mountains and did, 2 weeks later was so crippled by back pain that she couldn't get from the bathroom back to bed without my picking her up and carrying her. And after back surgery, she can just barely walk. And she was helping other people walk just 2 months ago. So I don't know. That seems like way too much evil to me. I don't really understand why God would do that and allow that. But on the other hand, I don't know how I could possibly know for sure that it's too much. There are lots of things in the world that are beyond my understanding. Lots of things work out for the best that I don't get. So given that I seem to think that God is allowing way too much evil in the world, but also that I have to grant that I don't see the whole picture and that maybe this is somehow conducing to a greater good, can God give me some kind of ground to trust him anyway, right? If God's not going to explain himself fully to me, which he apparently isn't, even after years of theology, he hasn't given me the code that lets me know what it is. Otherwise, I would blow Dan Brown right out of the water. No. So has he given me grounds to trust him anyway? Well, he gives me the kinds of clues that I shared with you, that the world actually seems to be pretty well designed to do the good things that need to be done. That helps to think the world might be designed to help us despite its appearances. But that's not enough for me. Maybe it's not enough for you. And I'm glad then as a Christian, and not just a believer in God, I'm glad that as a Christian, I can turn to the figure of Jesus of Nazareth. And in the Christian Bible, which I think I've got good reason to trust as being a reasonably reliable account of Jesus, and there are people who don't see it that way, of course, but lots of intelligent people do. And in the account that I see of Jesus of Nazareth in the New Testament of the Christian Bible, it seems to me that I do see not only a very fine man doing very interesting things, but I believe what the Christian religion says about this fine man, and that he is actually the face of God. That Jesus is not simply a godly person gesturing toward God, not just a prophet who speaks for God, but that Jesus is actually, in a way that I don't understand, nobody understands, that Jesus is actually the human face of God. And if that's true, and there are lots of reasons to doubt whether that's true, but there's also lots of reasons to believe it is. And if that's true, then instead of only looking at the newspaper or the evening news and concluding that God, if God there be, is a kind of monster, a kind of maniac, which is an easy inference to make from the news, I turn to Jesus and I find what I need to see. God who is indisputably on my side. God who is incontrovertibly loving toward us. Now again, it all depends on whether the Orthodox Christian teaching about Jesus is true. If Jesus is simply a prophet, he could be wrong. If Jesus is simply a holy man, he could be well-meaning but actually incorrect. But if Jesus is in fact the face of God, as traditional Christians like me believe he is, then that's the reassurance I need. That was the reassurance my grandmother had that helped her get through those 30 years. Is that she believed Jesus loved her and that Jesus was God, and therefore God could only have meant well for her even in her illness. My mother believed that too, and so does my wife. And so I hope to have faith like theirs. So friends, necessary evil, we can always imagine that things could be better. I can imagine things can be better, so can you. But we have the opportunity to trust that God, who really does know all and see all, is doing the best that can be done. God can only rehabilitate us as quickly as we can go. He can only reshape the human race as fast as we can tolerate it. God is a good physiotherapist. God is a good counselor. He is a good coach and parent. Do you think he would like to move things along faster than they go? I kind of think he would. I don't think it's because God's not trying hard. I think it's because he's pushing at us about as fast as we can go, and we're just slow and stubborn. I am. Maybe you are too. So it's comforting for me to see that human face of God and to know that no suffering is wasted. It will all somehow connect into a plan for the world's good. Because God loves us, he refuses to give us what we want. He gives us instead exactly what we need. And the question is, will I take it? Will you? Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, John. Thanks, everyone. It's good to be here with you, coming across from Sydney today. I did jump at the chance, as Craig said, to be part of this discussion. It's one that I guess is a personally important one for me. And I have a bit of a personal connection with John as well. I'm a former student of John's in Regent College in Vancouver, so this is a good chance for me to sort of grill the teacher a little. John is a great author, plenty of his books, one of which is on this very topic. Recommend that to you. He's someone who the media, very large and important media organisations, the New York Times, others have sought his opinion on things, including the Centre for Public Christianity, I think, yes. John, at various points, so that's very elevated and esteemed. You've also been on Q&A, and I believe, unless Tony Abbott's banned you, you're going to be on next week as well, right?
Well, I think there actually are more and more spots opening up daily on Q&A.
Yes, I'm waiting for my call, but it hasn't come yet, so we'll see. There are some spots opening up there. We want to press you, John, on some of these very important points that you made, and thank you for making them. And I want to kind of give voice to some of the questions that I imagine are going to be here in the audience. And some of you, please keep texting your questions in. They'll come to me eventually once John and I have talked about this, and I'm hoping to give as many people an opportunity to ask those questions as we can. You might know that the comedian and actor Stephen Fry was interviewed earlier this year on Gay Byrne's program, The Meaning of Life. It's a great interviewing program. And he was asked, Stephen Fry is a well-known atheist, and he was asked, what if his atheism proved wrong and he eventually had to face God? What would he say to him? And Fry, quite famously, got a lot of attention at the time, gave this sort of remonstration against the injustices and the miseries of human life, and a great articulation of those. And he said things like, bone cancer in children. What's that about? What's going on with a God who allows that sort of thing? And he said, and eventually it was a very upfront, he said, how dare you create a world in where there's so much misery and it's not our fault? This is utterly evil. And he described God as a monster, capricious, mean, sort of maniac. And there'll be people here tonight who are feeling that way when they look around them. There's a sort of an emotional force to that argument that's there that I understand. I suspect you do too, don't you? Do you feel the weight of this question?
Yeah, I watched that exchange as well, and in fact, the first thing I thought is that Stephen Fry would have to have almost supernatural courage if that's really what he would do. and I'm not sure he's really telling the truth, actually. I think he may be scoring a couple of rhetorical points. I mean, if someone like Stephen Fry or myself suddenly was ushered into the presence of this gigantic supreme being, I'm not sure the first thing out of my mouth would be, bone cancer in children. It might be more like, don't kill me, don't kill me, or crush me, whatever, because that's the typical response of human beings around the world when they're encountering the divine, even if they're angry with that God. So I thought, I'm not sure he's really imagining himself in the presence of God.
No, but it is a rhetorical question, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
And he's expressing it. You could sense the hurt and the kind of anger.
Well, that's the thing, is that I think that I really would encourage Mr. Fry to think about that really, even if he won't want to do it in public, and I understand that when he's on camera, but to think about, well, suppose there really is a God, because it seems to me that answer is maybe there's a God, but probably isn't. I mean, I'm reminded of Woody Allen's line that an atheist is someone who doesn't believe in God and is really angry with God for not existing. And so I'm wondering if Mr. Fry is really angry at God for not existing, because he clearly has a lot of passion about this. He really is upset about it. And I'm wondering, honestly, who are you angry at? Are you angry at Christians who fed you a Christian line that turned out not to be true? Are you angry at parents who gave you certain moral teaching that turned out to be groundless? Are you angry at resources going to the Christian church that waste all this money telling people things that are patently false when they could be going to atheist societies or something else that would actually do some good? So I'm wondering about that, or whether it's just, and this is where I think I really connect with him, whether it's just the pain we all feel that this misery seems so pointless. That you go to a pediatric cancer ward, and I've actually been on pediatric cancer wards with my dad. And it's not just heartbreaking, it's almost vertiginous. Like I almost sort of lose my footing. It just seems so awful. So of course we want to know about that. And I would say that, as I've suggested tonight, and I say at length in my book, that there are ways in which families, and this is what helped to be a doctor's kid, that these weren't just anonymous kids suffering in the cancer ward, because that's just evil, out of context and horrible. But I've actually gotten to know a couple of these families, and what they will say is, as awful as this has been also a dark blessing for our family. Now, they're very quick to say, and we don't want it. We would glad to give back the blessing if we could avoid the cancer. All right, they're honest about that. But they'll also say that things have happened to us and in us and through us for others that couldn't have happened some other way. So at that point, I think the danger is to kind of abstract suffering from its context, then say, explain this and how this could possibly be good. And I'm suggesting that the only way to explain it is to put it back in its context and see what happens. One more quick example. I mentioned my grandmother's 30 years with MS, and she was one of the most saintly people I met, and she didn't seem to need suffering to become more holy. But my granddad did. And for those 30 years, he had to leave the job that he loved, the job for which he neglected his family when my dad and his sisters were growing up, and he had to care for my grandmother in increasingly basic and intimate ways as her system slowly failed. And he was apparently quite a nasty piece of work. He'd been an alcoholic, and he'd been a workaholic. But when I knew him at the end of the 30 years, he was a very different man. And so I think in context, we might say that God called my grandmother to the terribly difficult vocation of suffering on behalf of her husband. And that's the only way my grandfather could be rehabilitated. I bet my grandmother would say it was worth it. But isolated from that relationship with my grandfather, of course it seems pointless.
The question that Stephen Fry asks only really makes sense if there's a God, isn't there? Because if there is no God, there's no one to complain to. It's a wonder that any of us have any sort of happy existence, isn't it?
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, the problem of evil isn't a problem, not only for atheists. It's not a problem for a number of the religions around the world. That It's not a problem for Shaivites. It's in devotional Hinduism. It's not a problem for most forms of Buddhism. It's not a problem for Chinese religion, whether it's Taoism or Confucianism or Chan Buddhism. It's only really a problem for those of us in the Jewish, Christian, Muslim sphere and others which believe in an all-good, all-powerful God. That's a lot of us, but it isn't a problem for lots of others. Mm-hmm. It's just to be endured.
So there's this sort of philosophical, we could break this up into sort of a philosophical question here, and I want to push you a bit more on that for a moment, and then we might come back to the more personal question of suffering people. So you've given this case for how we can't just know that there isn't a good reason for suffering to continue, and some of us might think, okay. You've also said that the kind of world that allows us to truly love and be loved is one in which there's freedom whereby we might choose otherwise. Okay. But some of us here would be left wondering about the nature of the kind of freedom that would allow and perhaps even require the suffering of children. And we're not talking about just the sort of suffering that can be helpful to us in the long term, where you kind of go through difficult things and we accept that. But I mean the sort of horrific, violent, cruel, what has to be pointless suffering that we see around the world and in our neighbourhoods, sort of awful rape and torture and sometimes of defenceless children. How on earth can that be part of this bigger, grander, happier scheme that you've laid out for us?
I don't know. In Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, he has a couple of horrific images of soldiers bayoneting babies in front of their mothers. And there's other famous passages there. And of course, Dostoevsky is a Christian believer writing this stuff. And it's not just non-Christians who ask Christians these things and non-Jews who ask them. In the pages of the Bible itself, God's own favorites often say to God, how long are we going to suffer? This seems pointless. This seems way too much. You're overdoing it. We learned what goodness was from you, and you're not behaving yourself accordingly. And sometimes God gives them good answers, and sometimes he doesn't. But sometimes his answer is, in the classic book in the Hebrew Bible, the book of Job, is, I think, to paraphrase greatly, is to say, well, Job, the world's complex, and I made it. I know it is. But it's really complex, and you want me to account for what I'm doing, but you can't even make a horse. So how am I going to start giving you the flow chart of everything that's happened in the world and all the decision trees I've had to face, and have you look on and say, oh yeah, I guess I do approve of how you've run things. So it's not that I don't recoil in horror when I look at these evils too. Of course I do. I'm supposed to. And I would be a monster if I didn't feel terrible about that. And if I didn't pause while I'm writing philosophy on my computer to go, that's just really horrible. It is really horrible. But I don't think I have the capacity to understand how that could be good. And I clearly don't. And God doesn't seem to have given us a clue to that, even in the pages of his holy book. So, what has he given me instead? He's given me good grounds to trust him anyway. And I frankly have to run to that, because I don't know why. It seems horrible to me too.
There's a wonderful film, Irish film last year called Calvary. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's a story that presents the church in its ugliest way as well as its most beautiful. Mm-hmm. And there's a Catholic priest who's the central figure there. But there was one moment in that film that I think, there are plenty of moments in that film that are relevant for this discussion, but there was one where a young doctor told the priest that he once was treating someone, a little kid who'd been afflicted by some terrible disease, and the details I can't quite remember. It was something like this kid was going to be blind, deaf, and paralysed, but alive for the rest of their life. It was a moment. It was sort of a visceral. When I watched it, I had this sort of reaction to that sort of horrifying nightmare kind of scenario. And I wondered then, why God would not intervene at this point if he is an interventionist God. Because it doesn't seem that that would change the freedom that you've talked about here. That doesn't seem to me, at least, that it would. Or is it the case that Christians have too much spoken about an interventionist God? Because Christians talk about God kind of sometimes even a sense of speaking to the Christian, or God opening up a path for them to have a career in a certain direction, or God, paving the way for them to meet their wife, and so on. So if they're to speak in those terms, and yet at the same time say, but God won't intervene in this situation, some of us find that hard to put those two things together. Can we?
Well, I think the only way to put it together is to say that if we do believe that God does sometimes intervene and change the normal course of events and to do something else, and this is where my theme music comes up. So I'll come to my dramatic conclusion. That since if we believe that God is deistic and removed and can't do it, that's a different problem. But given the biblical understanding of God, then in the case of this child who's facing this horrible medical outcome and this continued existence, I would say, well, of course God can intervene. I mean, for one thing, that God can cause this young person's system to fail and can bring him to a happier whole-bodied existence in the world to come. God can do that at any time, and I think God does that for children all the time. He rescues them from horrible situations by allowing them to die, because Christians don't believe death is the worst thing that can happen to you. In fact, death is often seen, of course, by Christians as a gateway to something much better. So death isn't the same thing that it is for people who have no hope beyond the grave. It's not the worst thing that can happen to you. So this actually seems worse than death, right? To be kept in this situation of blindness and deafness and paralysis. So from the logic from which I'm speaking, is there has to be some good reason for God to let this child continue in the world. And it has to be so good that it outweighs the difficulty that child is going to have for the rest of his or her life. Because otherwise, yes, God would either terminate the child's life or heal him. Like, the choices aren't 26. The choices are, quite finite. So then you'd say, well, then why do you keep clinging to this desperate idea that God always has a good reason in the teeth of these cases which seem to be so horrible? Well, again, I'd have to have an awfully good reason for that. Now, I do believe that in some of these horrible situations, I've seen, and perhaps you have too, situations of truly horrible suffering that has also resulted in remarkable outcomes that were really difficult to imagine them coming any other way. And secondly, I also think that I don't know as much as I think I do, so sometimes that could be happening and I don't see it or know it. It would be arrogant of me to presume that I do. But in the third case, it just doesn't make logical sense. I think we really do face either atheism or we trust God to know what God's doing and can believe that he is not allowing people to suffer pointlessly. Because to believe that the God who is imaged in Jesus Christ is indifferent to your suffering or mine or this child's, that doesn't make sense. And that's why I'm a little impatient with people who claim to be traditional Christians and yet are willing to grant the idea of gratuitous evil. That doesn't add up to me.
So John Lennox, who I think was here last year, made the point that you can face this problem and decide, well, there's no God, but he notices two things. You don't get rid of the suffering if you get rid of God in this scenario, but you do lose hope in the sort of hope that you're talking about.
That's right. I mean, do we want evil in the world? No, we don't. But what we really also don't want is, in fact, pointless suffering, where it's just a world spinning on and too bad.
Has this question ever for you, you've mentioned periods in your life of either experiencing suffering yourself or watching people you love dearly go through awful things. Has it ever caused you to doubt your faith in any substantial way?
You mean like today?
Yeah.
Well, I don't mean that terribly glibly at all. When my wife was going through this most recent episode, because I'm a theologian, I have a direct line to God, and I heated up the wires. I blistered God's ear. I mean, I was really angry. And I'm not kidding. I was really angry because I thought, okay, this is it. This is what I wrote about in my book. You know, this is gratuitous evil. Like, this makes no sense. There doesn't seem to be any reason why Carrie is going through it. But we're not gaining any new information, right? The pain isn't telling us anything we don't already know. We know that she's got a bad back situation like this, and we're going to go to the doctor as soon as we can. We got the surgery scheduled, so just turn down the volume. Like, there's no reason for it. So yeah, I had it out with him. And you know what he said? Nothing. And he said, I think the implication was, well, you know what you need to know. You just hang in there. You got to trust me that I love Carrie more than you do, and I am weeping over her suffering more than you are, and I hate that she has to suffer. And if there were an easier way, John, for me to save the world, don't you think I'd do it? Because I'm impressed as a Christian by one of the most powerful stories in the Bible, where Jesus, who Christians believe is God's own son, the night before he's facing crucifixion and death, actually says to his Father, isn't there an easier way? Can't we do this without me actually going to a cross? And he prays it 3 times, and he prays it like 3 different ways. And the same answer comes back. No, there isn't. Of course, if I could do it, a loving father would say, of course I wouldn't put you through the cross. So if God is facing a situation so dire that he, and as his son, so to speak, has to suffer this horrible amount on our behalf, then it shouldn't surprise us that there's a lot of suffering in store for others of us as well. I mean, the situation is apparently really bad, and only really severe means are going to be adequate to deal with it. And I just don't think I can get my head around that.
Can you comment on the God who suffers? You hinted at that there. That to me has some potential.
Well, it's a very big deal in the Christian faith, and it's the only religion I can think of. I taught world religions for 20-some years, but there is no other religion that makes this unusual claim. It doesn't mean that Christianity is true. It doesn't mean that Christianity is necessarily better. But it is interesting that Christianity says that when God calls us to suffer, he knows what he's talking about. And he doesn't say it lightly. He's suffered too. And he suffered not analogously to us, but just as us. So he really knows. And he doesn't just know about the horrible physical pain of scourging and the horrible pain of crucifixion, but he knows about betrayal. He knows about his own friends running for cover. He knows about being left alone when he needs human companionship the most. Like, he knows about the worst sides of human suffering. And so he does not lightly call us to suffering either. And that, to me, is a very different situation than wondering why God in the heavenly control room doesn't do a better job of pulling the levers and pushing the buttons to make things come out better. Because if he could just step aside, I'd do a better job.
So he has suffered, he knows what it is to suffer, but is there an ongoing suffering as he watches his people who he loves suffer?
Well, I mean, you catch me at a vulnerable time, in that we have 3 sons, all in their 20s, and they're all going through massive life transitions while I'm in Adelaide. And the eldest is getting ready for his wedding, and the middle one just lost his job in New York City and is trying to find another way before his next incredibly high rent check comes due. And the youngest has just graduated into the economy, which has not thrown a party for him yet. And so every day I'm here, I'm finishing my teaching and this wonderful conversation that we're having on such a pleasant subject.
Only
to go back to my hotel room and find out which of my sons is in the more dire circumstances. And sure, it's first world problems, but they're problems. You know, I love my sons, and I don't sleep well if they're not sleeping well. Now that's just, you know, the eldest is getting married and the youngest is in a first world city, and he can always come home if he has to, and the youngest one is living at home, and you know, we can cope. And that keeps me awake at night. How much more does God stay awake at night over a planet that he loves and over the really significant suffering that's happening in Adelaide, let alone the rest of the world?
Yeah, I won't comment on your son getting married being considered a suffering situation for him. But
No, it's the planning the wedding is the suffering part.
Yes. No, that can be
suffering.
truly trying. What about natural disasters? The earthquake in Nepal, we've got all the already vulnerable people. They're losing people they love. They're killed or left homeless. It can start to look pretty random, but there's a sense within Christianity that says something about the creation itself, isn't there? About a sort of renewal of the creation. We read about creation groaning in anticipation of that.
Well, again, it seems to help me, and I can only give you what I got, right? Because I don't have all the answers for this.
Don't you? I thought
I'm sorry. Yeah, you have to pay much more than these people paid to get all the answers. I'd go to that. I'd just sit in the audience and get all the answers if I could. But it seems to me, again, it's helpful to be careful not to let ourselves be so overwhelmed by the news stories of the day that we decontextualize them. And if we just let them pile up, we'll just go mad with grief. But in fact, there isn't simply an earthquake in Nepal. There is, but there are thousands of individual stories being played out there, as well as global stories of people in other nations being moved to compassion, being moved to think about someone else for a change, to actually step up and maybe make a change of lifestyle, to maybe move to Nepal to help with the rebuilding effort. And you know people like that. I know people like that who these things actually contribute to all sorts of goods, even though they're truly horrible situations. But if we decontextualize them and just look at them as sort of floating in the air horror stories, of course they terrify us. But that's never the case. They never are decontextualized. There's always something going on there. Now, to be sure, a lot of the evil in the world that we call natural evil is exacerbated by us, right? I mean, there's not enough food to go around, but there actually is enough food to go around if we didn't let it rot on the docks as using food as a kind of political weapon, as it happens so often in some parts of the world, or if we didn't eat some of the things we like to eat that are extremely high energy consuming foods. There are lots of so-called natural evils in the world. If we didn't actually allow the situation in the Philippines to be such where the only way poor people can get to work is get on ferries that actually are not properly regulated, and then they turn over when they hit a big wave, like that's a natural disaster. But whose fault is that? It's our fault. If you had a proper ferry regime, if you had proper regulation, if you had jobs for these people that didn't require them to do it, like this isn't for God to intervene. This is up to us. Now, I'm not letting God off the hook. I mean, nobody can stop a volcano from blowing up. I mean, that's God's business, and there are other things like that. But I do think that a lot of the havoc that is wreaked by natural disasters is actually us not being responsible about a world that is predictably dangerous in a lot of ways. And then those that we can't predict, and those natural disasters that do seem to be genuinely God's fault, I think it's worth actually slowing the picture down, zooming in, and to the extent that we can, say, now, what's been the result of that? Rather than rushing to judgment and saying, that's horrible, and the end. In other words, whereas I think what I'm trying to suggest tonight is that's horrible, and it's not the end. Each horrible thing sends ripples out into the world. And God is using those for our greater good. That's my confidence that he's doing that, even though I often don't see what's going on in that.
I've got more, but I want to turn now to people's questions that are coming in from the audience. If heaven is eternally without evil, it doesn't seem necessary then, so why is it necessary now? You've argued it achieves some good stuff for us, but are we going to miss out on all that in heaven? Either heaven is, by your definition, deficient without evil, or must still have evil.
If I have suffered some kind of injury, or I am recovering from surgery, one of the first people that I will see in the hospital is somebody like my wife, a cheerful physiotherapist who is coming to hurt me. And she's going to make me move when I don't feel like moving. And she's going to get me out of bed when I don't feel like getting out of bed. And she's going to make me walk when I don't feel like walking. And she's going to make me walk more than I want to. And she's going to finally put me on certain kinds of machines that are going to make me hurt even more. I've often thought, what a terrible job my wife has. She walks into the room and people start crying. You know? I only get to do that twice a year during exams. But once I have rehabilitated my knee, once I have recovered from my surgery, she doesn't keep doing that. She says, goodbye. You're done. You're healed. And that's what we look forward to in the world to come, is being rehabilitated and being so confirmed with an appetite for goodness that we no longer have an appetite for evil. We no longer are deranged. We no longer mistake where our proper interests lie. We no longer try to help people, but in fact hurt them. We actually see things clearly. Once we are rehabilitated, there's no more need for that pain and suffering, and the Bible promises it'll all be gone.
Okay.
Thank you for that warm affirmation, by the way.
Well,
I thought that was a pretty good answer. Thank you.
I guess
that's what you get from Sydney, you know. It's okay.
I guess I feel the kind of suffering that's good for us takes me so far.
Yeah,
but I get uncomfortable, to say the least, as I think does our next questioner. Jesus seemed to resist the evil of disease, blindness, etc. by healing it. Why the change in policy now? Why is it now meant to grow us, etc.? So to give the context, this person says, my wife has Parkinson's disease. As Christians for 30 years, it's not easy to be content with your approach. We struggle with faith out of that.
Yeah, my dad was getting Parkinson's toward the end, and it's pretty awful. I'm really sorry. For the folks who sent that in, it is pretty bad, and it wasn't 30 years, and it was still pretty bad. I mean, of course you struggle with it. As I confess to you, I struggled with it, a few weeks ago, and my wife was in trouble. I mean, and I write books and give lectures on this, and I still was yelling at God about it because it just seemed too much. It just seemed way too much. So I sympathize, perhaps more than I sound like I do. But at the same time, I'd say, well, you've only got a certain number of choices. You can believe that this is pointless, which is really horrible, or you can trust that it actually is going to do some good, which you yet can't see. But the only way to do that with any kind of rational integrity is to believe that there are good grounds to believe that God is good despite what you're seeing in the context of this chronic disease. And that's why, yes, these large-scale theological answers I'm giving can help to some extent. But I think we really do have to do what Martin Luther told us to do, which when it comes right down to it, you have to run away from the God you can't see to the God you can. You have to flee the hidden God and run to Christ. Run to Christ. Because there you have the face of God, and you're going to get the God that you need to see, the God who is loving and is tender and is gentle. And I feel badly for people who are Christians, but they're kind of God followers, but they're not really yet Jesus followers. Jesus is a really nice guy, maybe even the first Christian, but he's just a really pious guy who inspires them. Running to Jesus won't help very much. But I'm very grateful for the traditional view, which I think is the biblical view, that when we come to Jesus, we see what we need to see, which is God who really loves us. And he says, I'll hold you, and I'm not going to explain it. And actually, there's a good reason I don't explain it too, but can you trust me? And most of the time, I can. And other times, God just puts up with me yelling at him.
Christians often portray the world as getting worse as part of their gospel message, suggesting Christianity is a better alternative. But in lots of ways, the world's getting better. It's women's rights, increased education in developing countries. Which one of these is right? Are things actually getting worse? And if they're getting better, how should Christians change their message?
The world is getting worse, and it's getting better. You have another question you want to... I mean, I'm trained partly as a historian, and one of the things we learn in history is that history is not a thin stream just moving along in one direction in one line. History is more like a giant ocean current with actually various levels and even currents going in opposite directions at the very same time. So yes, in some ways, some things in the world are getting worse, and leading cultural indicators in various parts of the world would say yes, some things are worse and some things are manifestly getting better. So it's, guess what, complicated. It's a complicated world. And so I feel this person's impatience with Christians who are oversimplifying the situation and saying, aha, you see, I'm going to cherry pick a few trends in the world. That proves that the world's getting worse and badly needs Jesus, so we better hold on till Jesus returns. Now, I am holding on till Jesus returns, but Jesus has been taking his time. It's been like 2,000 years. He was coming back soon, and that's 2,000 years of soon. So apparently soon means something different to the Supreme Being than it does to me. But his lifespan's a lot longer, so maybe that's part of it. So I have to hang in there, and in the meanwhile, be glad for all the good stuff that God is doing. I mean, in many ways, the world is better than it used to be. We know more about agriculture. Global poverty is actually better than it was even 20 years ago. So lots of things are better in the world, and Christians should rejoice in that, even as they also say, but beware about thinking that utopia is just over the horizon. Mm-hmm. Because we seem to have a pretty sound, established habit of mucking up even the best situations we have. And it's that good and evil, it's that ambiguity that I think is partly why God does allow some really horrific evils in the world, to keep reminding us that even as some things are better, we are still riddled with a moral problem that needs a drastic solution.
Some suggest that something evil can end up being okay if the results are good. Some say God does that. He turns evil occurrences to his good purposes, so that makes him okay. But surely that's not right. The end can't always justify the means. If that's what God does, allow our evil so he can achieve good things at the end, he doesn't seem all that good. If he's causing childhood cancer for some ultimate good outcome, I'd prefer he gave us that good outcome without the childhood cancer. Thanks.
Well, so would I. But so would God. I mean, I don't really think I'm more morally sensitive than God. I don't think that I'm more logical than God. So surely, yes, if God could do things with less pain and suffering, why wouldn't God do that? I don't think there's any reason why he wouldn't. So therefore, he must not be able to. And it's not because God somehow lacks power as a supreme being. He's working with things as they are. God can only reshape me morally as fast as I can go. And a couple of months ago, I thought God was pushing rather too hard. I thought, I really can't take this. If you keep making my wife suffer like this, and it was night after sleepless night nursing Carrie, I thought, I'm not feeling warm, fuzzy thoughts about you right now. Quite the contrary, hot, negative thoughts about you. And so you better lighten up. And he didn't right away. You'll notice he didn't just go bing and everything was fine. No, it wasn't. It was a bad night, and it was another bad night. But then the nights got a little bit better, and things are better than they were, but they're not great. And God is pushing me as fast as I can go. So of course we would prefer, I totally agree with the questioner. I would much rather God fix the world without having to put us through what he has to put us through. Just like Jesus would rather have saved the world without going to a cross. But apparently that wasn't on offer.
Okay, thank you. You've mentioned that evil can be a discipline from God to get us to become better or closer to him. But many people endure so much suffering they feel like they're being driven away from God. Can you really blame them for that? And can God blame them for that? And I'm going to add, I want to perhaps think that he may not blame them for that, depending on the situation.
Yes, I think that depending on the situation, it may be that people are alienated from God as part of their journey. I don't think she'd mind me saying, but my aunt grew up in a home that was pious in some ways, but also pretty troubled in some ways, my mother's side of the family. And for a good 10 or 20 years, she basically had nothing to do with God, and she was pretty angry at God, even though she said she didn't believe in God. But boy, she was pretty angry about the God she didn't believe in for about 20 years. And I can understand that. I'm not making fun of her. She's my aunt. I love her. And it was awful for her husband, who was a Christian believer. It was awful for her kids, who grew up as Christians. But that's what she had. Now, she's come around, and she is in a better place. And, you know, she's still got quite a temper, but she's, in many ways, a beautiful and loving person. And she's sorted out a lot of that. Not all of it. She and God still have their fights. But she's in a much better place than she was before. And she was literally than she was at the beginning of this. She's in a better place. So some people have to take the long way around to get home. And that can even include bouts of atheism or at least resistance to God. And frankly, a lot of people are not actually resisting God and Jesus. They're actually really angry at the church. Or they're angry at their parents who were Christians. They're angry at something else that in their minds are understandably connected with God, and life has to separate that out for them so that they can be simply angry with mom and dad and not bring God into it. Or they can be upset with their life circumstances and then rearrange their understanding of that so that, in fact, God doesn't appear to be the villain of the piece after all. So human journeys are often complicated things. And for a lot of us, it's too soon to tell where we're going to be.
So if Jesus rose from the dead to fix the earth, why didn't he just stay to, well, fix it? He could have stayed and fixed it. Instead, he left and nothing changed. There's lots of questions here around why Jesus bothered healing people then but not now, although some would argue with that. And perhaps coming back to that Parkinson question, that someone would be feeling that strongly.
Well, let me pick up on the second one first, because I think somebody else asked it, and I didn't do a good job of answering that one. But yes, Jesus did heal in his earthly ministry. How come Jesus doesn't hang around to heal everybody? Well, that's a good question. In fact, it's an interesting question of biblical theology, why Jesus did such a relatively limited job of healing when he was healing. In fact, there are some curious stories in the New Testament. Fairly early on in Jesus' ministry, he heals in a northern city of Israel. And the next day, the word spreads, and one of his disciples comes to him and says, okay, everybody's gathered down there, and come on and do the healing thing again. Jesus says, no, I think we're going to go to some other towns and talk to them. Now, that's one of those stories they don't teach you in Sunday school, right? Jesus turns away from a needy group of people. So, kiddies, you start to cry, and candy. But he does that. Jesus does these odd things, almost as if he sees things differently than we do, almost as if he has a different perspective and sees more clearly how to get through the maze of life. So clearly, if the point of Jesus coming to earth was to heal everybody of their diseases, he did a pretty slapdash job of it. I mean, he should have hung around longer than 30-some years and avoided getting crucified so he could, heal everybody. So he really, that doesn't seem to be his priority. In fact, he doesn't even refer to healing as healing per se so much as signs. These are signs. These are indications of what I'm about. And even though healing is part of it, healing is only an indication of the central work I'm doing, which is to bring you back to God. If I simply heal your bodies, and you'll certainly come for that. If I simply feed the 5,000, you'll surely come to me for free bread, but you'll miss the main point, because what's really wrong with you is not physical illness and not deprivation. It is your moral confusion and rebellion, and I'm really here to start working from the inside out. And that's why, to answer the second question, when Jesus leaves, he doesn't leave and nothing changes. That's wildly wrong. He leaves, and this little group of ragtag disciples begins the largest social movement in global history, the Christian church. This little ragtag group on the Mount of Olives outside Jerusalem walks down the hill, and proceeds to multiply and multiply and multiply and actually take over the Roman Empire and begin to dominate Europe and then begin to dominate the Western world by extension, and now is truly a global phenomenon. Somewhere in the 1980s, Christianity stopped being a primarily Caucasian religion. I mean, this is the world's largest social fact, is the religion of Christianity. Now, like it or not, that's not nothing. That's pretty big. Now, why didn't Jesus go about that some other way? Well, that's a good question. To which I would say, who has a clue as to how you would do that better? But presumably God has a clue and decided that that was the way he had to do it. Do I think that was efficient? No. Can I think of ways that God could have done it better? Sure. He could have put gospel letters in the sky simultaneously around the world. Here's the truth. Check the box. Yes, no. You know, it would have been much quicker. But apparently God, for instance, didn't want to only save the people alive at the time of Jesus, but he actually wanted to save me and you. So he had to let 2,000 years of procreation unfold so that we could be here in Adelaide having this kind of conversation. I'm being serious about this. I mean, God has a very big, complicated plan to get the maximum amount of good out of this extremely complex situation. So I think the more you peer into it, the more interesting it becomes. And the more the texture of the specifics of the situation, to me, actually help, at least most of the time. But not when I or somebody I love are in acute distress and I cannot see any benefit for that. Then I mourn like anybody else.
The next question is one I can answer. This is someone wants to know the name of the book that you wrote on this topic. It's called Can God Be Trusted? Faith and the Challenge of Evil. That's right, isn't it?
That's right. Thank you.
Great. Next one. A lot of your...
I sent that one in.
Thanks.
Yeah. Available,
that came in from your wife, actually.
Yes, available in better bookstores nowhere, since they're all disappearing now, but yes.
Everything you've based everything you've argued tonight on the person of Jesus. This is the place you're trying to push us towards, right? And people will have varying views on that, but of course our knowledge of that is going to come out of the New Testament and then of course attached to the bigger picture. What are you going to tell us in terms of that, for those who are feeling less convinced than you are about the strength of that material, to say something to us today?
Well, I think we can be, if I understand your question, we can be somewhat minimalist about it. I think that to investigate the career of Jesus, you don't have to bite off more than you can chew. And by that I mean, in particular, you don't have to believe that the Gospels, those biographies of Jesus written putatively by disciples or friends of disciples, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, you don't have to believe that they are the inspired Word of God. That's way too big a leap to make. I mean, I don't even know how you would come to a reasonable conclusion about that. I mean, I think you have to kind of see that they're such, but I don't think there's any way to argue for that. So I would say instead that, sure, lots of Christians believe that, but lots of people believe lots of wacky things, so that may not be true. Instead, you simply have to be convinced that they're reasonably accurate portraits. Biased, for sure, because these are all disciples, they're all believers. But all you have to believe is that both despite their bias and because of their bias, they're trying to tell the story of Jesus as clearly as they can, as helpfully as they can. And in other words, are these reasonably reliable accounts of Jesus, even allowing for the limitations of each of these authors, like we would of any other historian, ancient or modern. And there actually are very good university-type reasons to believe that these are generally, even if not in every detail, I happen to think so because I'm an old-fashioned Bible thumper, but you don't have to go that far with me. You just have to believe that you're getting a reasonably reliable picture of Jesus. Because the kinds of things I'm saying about Jesus aren't in the fine-grained details of the Gospels. They're everywhere. They're right on the surface. Like you can't, when you read the Gospels, you can't escape the oddness of Jesus, the strangeness of Jesus. That here's a good man, and he seems kind and compassionate and actually somehow humble, who also is willing to accept worship as a Jew from fellow Jews, which is the worst kind of blasphemy. But he seems okay with that, and he seems okay with stories, the stories about him of stilling storms and exorcising demons and feeding multitudes. Like, these are outlandish stories. These are amazing stories. They're not simply stories about a nice moral teacher who has helpful things to say. So you'd have to drill into the good, solid, historical reasons to believe that these accounts are at least reasonably reliable accounts, and I think those reasons stand up to serious academic scrutiny. And then just read them and come to whatever conclusion you think you should come to. And if you are inclined, pray to God, if God there be, that if there's more to these books than simply historical accounts, that God will show you that. Because that's how people do come to believe that these are reliable accounts about somebody who really makes a difference.
Two more. One person just wants you to clarify whether you think there's no such thing as gratuitous evil.
Yeah, I actually do think that there's no such thing as gratuitous evil. I believe that on the basis of the intellectual argument I've made. Catch me at the wrong time, though, and I'm yelling at God about gratuitous evil, to be honest.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky's famous long discussion really on this topic, or at least large slabs of it. And he puts in the mouth of Ivan this great sort of vision of restoration at the end, where he says something like, like a babe, I trust that the wounds will heal, the scars will vanish, something so magnificent will take place that it will satisfy every human heart. Is that kind of vision of restoration sometimes pretty much all we've got to look forward to, or to look to give you strength in a time of enormous personal suffering?
Well, I think that's a helpful element. I mean, I have, as you say, pretty much pinned my hopes on Jesus, because I think that arguments of a theistic sort only take us so far. They're useful, but they're only limited, as I've suggested. So I'm looking back to the figure of Jesus and looking upward to the Jesus I think continues to exist. But you're right, I also look forward to a time when the usefulness of evil, which is really bad, like it's not kind of good, it's really bad, but God nonetheless is doing what needs to be done to get stuff done. I mean, the crucifixion of Jesus is the worst thing a Christian can imagine ever happening, but it had to happen for the world to be saved, and likewise the smaller but still equally terrible evils that others of us have to undergo seem somehow to be necessary to get done what needs to get done. In order to what? In order to bring us to shalom, in order to bring us to a properly functioning world. And part of the problem, I think, with Christianity today, as perhaps in Australia, it's certainly true in North America, is that the vision of where we're going that is supposed to make all of this suffering worthwhile, the vision of the world to come that is supposed to be the greater good that somehow justifies all these horrific, vivid evils, is itself such a pallid, unattractive picture. Like, God is going to save the world so that we can all end up on clouds being bored forever. Like, that doesn't seem worth it. I think of Gary Larson, who's one of our time's great theologians, right? And the Far Side, and there's this sort of bald chap with spectacles sitting in a white robe on a cloud, and the caption is, "I wish I'd brought a magazine."
Right, so if it's not that, what is it? Well,
it can't be that, right? I mean, am I going to go up to heaven and St. Peter's there and he checks my reservation and then I'm there and then I go off to a cloud and am issued a harp, and I don't even like playing a harp that much now, and I play it at you and you play your harp at me, and the worst thing about this, Simon, is that I can't die.
Yeah,
and I'm supposed to believe that justifies the pain and evil in the world? Well, no wonder nobody believes in Christianity. I mean, that's a terrible payoff. Like, I'm going to take the goodies now. you know, I'm going to go to McLaren Vale tomorrow and just drink my way into oblivion because that's so much nicer than this. But as a professor, I'll assign for homework the last 2 chapters of the Bible. And those last 2 chapters speak of the new city of God coming down from heaven to earth. We're not going up to heaven. That's up in the sky. We can't last in the sky. We're of the earth. And there is this new earth, and it's just like this one, except better in like every way. And this city to come is just as beautiful as Adelaide, except even better. Everything functions the way it's supposed to. There is a river of life that runs right down the middle, which is, you know, pretty impressive in Vancouver, but we have more rain than we can use. But in the Middle East, a river that runs right down the middle of a city is pretty impressive. It's pretty wonderful. And trees that fruit every season. And everybody gets along with each other. And God is present there. And we fan out to useful, productive work and interesting and pleasurable leisure. And all that's good about this world goes into the next world, except to an exponential degree. Like, that's really interesting. That's really exciting. And Jesus says, I've come, not that everybody would kind of suffer and finally become a thin, pallid angel sometime, but that we would have life and have it abundantly. Everything that's good about this world goes into the next world or something better. And that kind of vision helps me avoid some of the naughtiness to which I am inclined. Well, maybe I could give up that McLaren Vale visit and go to work tomorrow, because God would prefer me to do that. But also helps me sometimes, not always, I'm not that spiritual, but helps me sometimes to think, yeah, if I can get through this and get there, that really will be worth it. And the there is not heaven. The there is a world like this one, except better, that works the way it's supposed to, and I get to enjoy it forever. I'll try to suck it up and carry on.
It's a topic that's worthy of long discussion. We've had a good longish discussion, but I guess there'll be a good opportunity for lots of people to keep talking about this. We thank you for your thoughtfulness. Thank you for your honesty and your authenticity in tackling a very, very difficult topic with great poise and wisdom, and we're grateful for that. Thank you so much.
Good, thanks, Simon. Thank you.